Hi, everyone. Thank you. Well, that was quick for how many people are in this room, and this is much more people than we were expecting. This is fantastic. So for the people in the back, just so they're trying to find more chairs, so hopefully we can find ones for people. So I did want to welcome everyone to this evening's event, First Do Less Harm, the Future of Canada's Drug Policy. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the sacred land on which the University of Toronto operates. It has been the site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. This territory was subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwa and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have this opportunity to work in the community on this territory. I'd also like to acknowledge the events that have happened in the past weekend in Quebec City, and I'd like you now to join me in a moment of silence and solidarity for the members of our Muslim community who were victims of the terrorist attacks in Quebec. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be welcoming you all to this evening's event. My name is David Newman, and I'm the Senior Director, Student Experience at the University of Toronto and the Interim Director for the Centre for Community Partnerships, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here. The university has partnered with the Canadian Harm Reduction Network since 2008, including engaging in events, placing students in experiential learning courses, and other opportunities that have presented themselves. The mutual value of the relationship with people like Walter and Holly from the Canadian Harm Reduction Network has provided meaningful learning experiences for our students and important service and research for organizations. I'm really excited about today's program, and I'd like to extend a heartfelt thank you to the organizing committee. I'd now like to welcome Walter I always pronounce this wrong, Calavieri from the Canadian Harm Reduction Network for a few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to keep you long. There's a couple of things I want to say. I want to, first of all, acknowledge the organizing committee, and their names are in the program, and the university sponsors and the community sponsors as well. And I want to point out one thing in the program which may look a bit peculiar, and that is the thanks expressed to members of the cast of Hair, which played from 1969 to 71 at the Royal Alex Theatre. Two of the members of the cast are here. They're not going to sing and dance. You've got to be thankful for that. And nor am I, because I was part of that show as well. I was the stage manager. And I have to tell you that it was the most extraordinary, life-changing experience I ever had. And the fact that after all of these years, many of us are still friends, and many of us get together from time to time. We did just last Friday night get together over a meal and a wonderfully long conversation. It was terrific. So I want to thank them very much for giving me some guidance when I was much older than they were about living life to the fullest and starting me on a pathway away from theater and into the work I'm doing now. And now I'd like to introduce the moderator for tonight, who is Joe Fiorito. Joe is one of the people who I hold up as a model to me, or I would if I were ever going to be a writer, which I tried, but didn't get very far. But Joe is marvelous. I miss his columns from the Star. They were favorites of mine. And I've always felt that Joe is a poet at heart. But more than that, he was a chronicler of the life in Toronto that people often overlook, but which makes this a much more special place to live if we are observant. His book, Rust is a Form of Fire, which I read about a year ago, is a beautifully observed piece on Toronto, and I recommend it to you. When I finished reading it, I found myself looking at the city and the people in it in a totally different way, and it was a much richer experience. I think he has another book underway, and I'm looking forward to it. Joe has long been a champion of harm reduction, for which we are very grateful. And now I'm going to turn it over to Joe.
If I'd known Walter was going to say that, I would have brought books to sell. So I'm a big believer in living in the moment and trying to be present in the moment. And one of the responsibilities of living in the moment is that they come really quickly. And you have to kind of be alert to know when to grab a moment. It's kind of like the micro part of seizing the day is seizing the moment. This is a particular moment here, and it's made up of many parts. For a long time now, we've been stumbling towards some kind of rational policy about cannabis. I did most of my stumbling a long time ago. In the meantime, people are dying on the streets from fentanyl. We persecute drug users, while other countries have gone all the way and legalized drugs. We have some of the bravest people that it's possible to know, and many of them are in this room, who work in the field of harm reduction. And yet still, after all of the really good work that's been done in this town, and Toronto's been very progressive across the country in terms of harm reduction, there are still great swaths of people who have no idea what it is and who are frightened of the very notion, which means that there's more work to be done. We're on the verge of safe injection sites. You know, So most of what I know about drugs I learned in the 60s, and I have to tell you that you know, it may seem like it's staggeringly slow and really annoyingly slow, but by God, what a long distance to have come. And then today we have a member of Parliament who says flat out, unequivocally, that we should decriminalize drugs. Wow. I actually don't use drugs really, apart from alcohol, caffeine, ibuprofen, Fiorinol, dutasteride, Lipitor, Dilaudid on occasion, Tylenol 3 for a good part of next week when I have to go for a little operation, cannabis when I need a night's sleep. And after 30 years of abstinence, you laugh too soon. I'm still fighting 25 years of cigarette use. More pointedly, this is the whole subject of harm reduction is important to me because 4 of the 5 men in my family have drug or alcohol problems, and my oldest and my youngest brother died of drug-related problems. So the issue is very personal to me. Taking the larger view of what the hell's going on in the world right now, we have deeply weird shenanigans going on south of the border. And God knows what's going to happen. So we're in this moment that's made up of all these things. Now is a really good time to reflect, but it's a good time to lay down fresh challenges and to find what I hope are bright ways forward. We have a really fabulous panel assembled here. Very briefly and in turn, we're going to hear from Pat Erickson, who is a professor of sociology and criminology at U of T and a professor emerita at CAMH. I'll do fuller introductions as we go by. Trevor Stratton is here. Trevor's co-coordinator of the International Indigenous Working Group on HIV and AIDS. Dessy Pavlova is a writer and marketing strategist who works within the cannabis community. More particularly, she's vice chair of the board of Canadian Students for a Sensible Drug Policy. There should be many more organizations working for a sensible drug policy. Eugene Oscapella is here. He's well known to everybody in the room, I hope, a professor in the Department of Criminology at the University of Ottawa, more particularly a founding member of the Canadian Foundation for Drug Policy. And finally, and probably the guy who needs the least introduction in this room, Raffi Balian, who is manager of the Counterfeit Harm Reduction Program at South Riverdale. Give them a warm welcome, please. How this is going to work is that each speaker is going to get 10 minutes. If you do 9 minutes, nobody's going to object because that'll leave more time for questions afterwards. After each speaker is finished, and I'll keep the time on this, and I'll give you a bit of a notice when we're approaching time. We'll go straight through and hold the questions for later, and I'll moderate the questions until Walter tells me to stop moderating the questions. But let's begin with Pat Erickson. Interestingly to me, and importantly for all of us, she's the author of Cannabis Criminals, the first study of the impact of the criminalization of cannabis offenders. She's written about cocaine, about harm reduction. She's currently studying the normalization of cannabis. She has some thoughts on whether the new marijuana laws are a template for other drug reforms. Pat, if you'd come up, please.
Thanks, Joe. Seeing this fantastic turnout tonight, I just have to share a comment I got with you. From a few years ago, I got a comment on a grant proposal on studying adult marijuana use, and the reviewer said, well, isn't marijuana use passé? So clearly it isn't. And I want to, tonight, despite my gray hair, I've clearly been around for a few decades. I've witnessed the moribund Canadian drug policy for several decades. And I have really, at this point, I think, been challenged by Walter to think of the future, which is much more difficult than looking back. So just for context, so I went to the Addiction Research Foundation, 1973, to study the criminalization of cannabis users. And at that time, I thought, well, it's interesting. I'll work on it for 3 or 4 years, and it'll be legalized. I'll move on to something else. Now it's 2017. Let me just read a quote. Far-reaching debates will no doubt continue in the public and legislative forums until and even after a new cannabis policy has been implemented. In Canada, the point at which the present law is considered adequate has been passed. Policymakers are now deliberating the next step to take, published in 1980. So the Ledane Commission, though, was very important in that it identified the costs of criminalization to the users and to society. And that issue is still very much with us over 40 years later. In this period, virtually nothing changed. I know with Eugene and others here, we went to Ottawa, we had reports, we had presentations, we had committees, we had consultations. Nothing basically changed until now. And we are on the cusp, I think, of a very important time when we have a government who has stated that they are wanting to move from a criminal justice enforcement approach to a health one. So this is very significant. So the 3 points I want to touch on in my time are: after marijuana, what? How can a public health approach be advanced? And what does normalization offer to advance a new approach to drug policy in Canada? So does the task force report actually provide any kind of blueprint for other types of illicit drugs. And if you look at it, of course, the primary focus is, well, keep it out of the hands of youth and keep profits out of the hands of criminals. Then there's some other points. Decriminalization is not mentioned. It's assumed that once there's legal regulation, then of course the impact on users will disappear because there won't be an offense. But in the meantime, nothing is done about decriminalization. And there's really nothing, I think, that provides a very good blueprint for approaches to other drugs, because this report is very cannabis specific. And it talks about access and various harms and how to mitigate them through regulation that are very cannabis focused. So in reading it, I remembered the words of Norwegian criminologist Salate Niels Christie, and he said, drug users are the easy enemy. And yes, they have been the easy enemy, easy to punish, easy to lock up, easy to marginalize, to ignore, and to deprive of health benefits that most citizens can take for granted. So we've made some progress in that we now have a public statement saying, yes, drug users are people who deserve to be treated as citizens, and we should be concerned about their health rather than stigmatizing them. So I still, though, think that marijuana use is the easy issue. It's the easy issue because the polls are supporting policy change. Use is widespread. Most people have had some exposure to use directly or indirectly. They know it isn't what was depicted in the drug scares of the 60s. So I think it's an easy issue. And what we need is to fundamentally be aware that we have to rethink our whole approach, and we have to encompass all of this at drug use and not stop at cannabis. So what I conclude then, as far as the new policy proposals, is that we should applaud and encourage them because they are a first important step, and they can be a springboard to other types of improvements that are so greatly needed in our approaches to other forms of drug use. Secondly, how can a public health approach then be put into place? So although the government has shifted its emphasis, we have to keep in mind that health was also an issue back in the 70s and 80s. The portfolio was in health. We had non-medical use of drugs directorate. We had, I actually have a gold embossed letter from Mark Lalonde, health minister in the 80s, congratulating me on my contribution to cannabis policy. We had harm reduction put as a pillar of Canada's drug strategy. So we had some sort of promises and some lip service, but what did we get? Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. 20 years anniversary this May, right? That was proclaimed. And that was just the same old, as someone said in the House that day it was first passed on the eve of the Quebec referendum. We can now fight the war on drugs from the perspective of harm reduction. So, what I think, though, is important, if you look at their task force report on page 4, they talk about public health policy. And they identify the basic principles about controlling access, considering potency, purity, who can legally obtain it, age limits, public health principles. So the government knows what public health is. That's encouraging. I'm not sure the Harper government did. So even though we have then a statement favoring a public health approach, I'm here to say cautiously, it's not easy to put in practice. And sometimes it's helpful to get outside of our kind of drug framework and think about some other examples. So for instance, asbestos, we knew that was a bad thing a long time. It's only now been actually subject to more regulation of mining and export. Look at vaccination, great victory of 20th century public health, and has promoted great benefits to children and youth. But now there's an anti-vax movement. questioning that science and questioning the universality of it. So public health is a struggle. It isn't just in our drug field. It's going to be a struggle. On the other hand, the pendulum can go the other way, like naloxone. I mean, we know that was a way to save lives. People are having opiate overdose, yet it was hard to get for a long time. People couldn't carry it. Now it's been made available without prescription. This is a tremendous victory. But it didn't come without political pressure. It didn't come because of public health and evidence. It came because of the terrible epidemic we're experiencing. So I then saying there's a lot of barriers to implementing a true public health approach across the board. And we have to be mindful, 100 years of baggage for prohibited drugs, stigma, hostility, prejudice, economic interests, in expanding prisons, the example in the US. There's a whole lot of things to consider that really mean we have to really struggle and work to promote public health, because this should be the future of Canadian drug policy. Third, normalization. Let me say a word here, because normalization may, I think, is the concept and the literature, the research, provides some support for public health, one type of support from the somewhat academic side of things. And if you take no other message from my few remarks tonight, please take away normalization is not a dirty word. It is not. It's a very important concept in the drug field. It means that basically to us, in the research literature and international literature, it's the occasional use of certain substances in certain settings and in a controlled way. It views the users making reasoned choices. And in the task force report, they actually make a very dismissive comment about normalization could lead to cannabis use being widespread. It isn't. And if we don't stop promotion and marketing, normalization will occur. Well, I have news for them. We have a funded 4-province study. We've published a lot of papers. People can get references. And we found that cannabis use is already normalized. People use it sensibly. For the most part, they're concerned about health. They balance out risks. And in fact, users themselves are important sources of information. So I believe normalization has utility to expand to other drugs as well, not just cannabis. That's in the most study. So in conclusion, marijuana reform should only be the first step before we move on very forcefully to advocacy of public health for all substances. And that will take different forms according to the drug, but we need to think through a policy within that framework. It'll take time, and it should involve formal adoption of various measures around drug harm reduction and programs. And normalization, after all, we see users as kind of the emissaries of harm reduction. So we focus on developing these strategies for the future, and I think in that sense we have a chance to reduce harm. Thank you.
The smart people in the room will remember to address their public health policy drug questions to Pat at the end. The really smart people who are casting about for a thesis might want to consider what a lifetime of work in the field is like and what she's learned, and that's all I'm saying there. Our next speaker, Trevor Stratton, as I said, he's the coordinator of the International Indigenous Working Group on HIV and AIDS. He's also a member of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, an activist, a volunteer, a consultant, and one of 2 North American delegates to the Joint UN Program on HIV and AIDS. He has a few things to say, I think, about prescription drugs and First Nations, and about the lawsuit currently against the government over the provision of clean needles in prisons. Please welcome Trevor Stratton.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Yes, I am Trevor Stratton, and I am a band member of Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. My mom was born and raised there and buried up on the hill, and my dad's fifth-generation English Canadian, so that's why you see this pink Indian before you. You know, I've been working with the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network for over 10 years, and it was the Indigenous community and the HIV activist community that kind of didn't judge me, let me know that I was part of the family, and welcomed me and provided a place for me. And ever since, I've been trying to give back. I developed AIDS back in 1997, and I thought I was going to die. And it was only through harm reduction and through the support of community and my family and my friends that I can still contribute valuably to this movement and to my community. So I want to welcome you to Toronto, to the streets of Toronto, as a band member of Mississaugas of the New Credit. If you've never been welcomed to Toronto on this territory, you have been now. Years ago, I started getting to know AIDS service organizations through the North Island AIDS Coalition. It doesn't exist anymore, out on Vancouver Island, where my wife had reached out trying to deal with her husband's diagnosis of HIV, and I was getting sick, and kind of pulled me in, and they had a survey there, and they asked about Indigenous people. And I suggested that, they said, what should we do around HIV? The rates are going crazy. And I said, my suggestion was to invite some Indigenous people to help build their capacity and help train them and have them go into their own communities and bring out the kind of advice that you're looking for. And they actually did that. It freaked me out that my advice actually was followed, and they hired an Indigenous worker who started to do work on the First Nations and with other Indigenous groups. Fast forward a little bit, I was the president of Two Spirited People of the First Nations. I was elected one evening back in, it must have been 1999, somewhere around there. And that evening, 4 of us, Indigenous people living with HIV, were smoking a joint in the alleyway, and I got arrested with marijuana. And they searched me, and they found another tiny little piece of magic mushroom. Someone had given it to me. I broke up with my wife. Here, you'll feel better. And I forgot about it. And I was arrested and charged with that. And I went through an alternative system, an alternative justice system for Indigenous people, where I sat in front of a circle of elders and community leaders. And they asked me, how can we help you? And that really showed me a difference in the way people are treated. And eventually I ended up not having a record. And what I asked for is some counseling, because I was feeling pretty damn lonely and depressed after being single and being in the city and starting over again. So that really helped me. And instead of being punished, I was helped. So I wanted to share that little story about that. Years later, everybody knows how much pot I smoke. They asked me at the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network to write a background paper on medical marijuana. So I just say, I wrote the book on medical marijuana as a kind of a joke. It was just it's just not very thick. It wasn't very detailed, but one of the things that highlighted is that through a care, treatment, and support study that we did at the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network, we found out that 1/3 of our membership living with HIV/AIDS used medical marijuana, medicinal cannabis, as part of their alternative treatment. So that we realized that we had a mandate to advocate around marijuana, but even more, we started to talk to people who were actively using and asking them what it was like, asking their advice. And it was through my activism, being a person living with HIV and a person with experience in drug use, in sex work, in prison, where I understood the meaning of nothing about us without us. And that goes for Indigenous people too. When we're looking at policies around Indigenous people, we should be inviting Indigenous people to the room. So years ago, in 2006, I want to tell you a little bit about the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network and some of the work they've been doing in harm reduction cheerleading, or bringing people together and doing consultations. Back in 2006, we developed something called Making It Our Way, which is a community mobilization toolkit, which was for Aboriginal people living with HIV, professionals and paraprofessionals. And we thought that in order to have any kind of mobilization, we needed different people from different sectors of our society. So people living with, that's the Nothing About Us Without Us. We wanted professionals like nurses and doctors, but we also wanted paraprofessionals like our community health representatives and even school coaches and people like that. So, and elected leaders, to get them around the table in order to mobilize all of the community, not just one section of it. And we had some real success shopping this around. This mentioned harm reduction once. If you search it, it talks about harm reduction. It was the first time that we were actually on the national level started to talk about harm reduction. The next year, Walk With Me, Pathways to Health, a harm reduction service delivery model was developed, where we identified 4 different groups that are at risk for our people. That's women, youth, prisoners, and Two-Spirit men, or LGBT men. Because, the messaging that's going out to the mainstream around HIV wasn't quite reaching our people, because if you look at who's getting HIV, or the modes of transmission for HIV in Canada, it's almost 2/3. It's between men who have sex with men. But if you look only at the Indigenous population, the mode of transmission that's almost 2/3 is injection drug use. So we really started to pay attention to that. It's addictions, or at least drug use, or at least the risky behavior around drug use that is really driving our epidemic. So that made us realize we needed to start selling this, because we were getting opposition from our political leaders, our elected leaders. And when you talk about Aboriginal community, it's very tricky to know what you're talking about. Are you talking about Indigenous civil society? That's the NGOs built on the Canadian not-for-profit law? Or are you talking about chief and council, or traditional systems of government? Because they're two different things when you talk about community. Our First Nations communities, or our Inuit hamlets, or our Métis settlements will say, you NGOs are not community. You are some kind of Canadian civil society that's Indigenous. We're the community. So when you talk about community ownership, you have to be careful there and know who you're talking to and know who you're talking about. In 2011, we developed a harm reduction implementation guide. This is when I was doing this work for harm reduction. And what we wanted to do is, instead of creating this polarized kind of opposition and telling them you've been doing the bad things and doing the wrong thing all this time, we wanted to say we're all very much alike. We've come from this same place, this same intergenerational trauma. Some of us just aren't handling it as well as others. Some of us, our coping mechanisms are different. But we all come from this same place. And we talked about guiding principles, and how harm reduction actually is an Indigenous principle. We had to frame harm reduction like within our own cultural framework. It's like if female genital mutilation. You can't go to Africa and say, what you've been doing for hundreds of years is wrong, you're bad, and you need to change it. What has to happen is within the cultural framework, that's where the work has to be done. Not this other hammer that comes and hammers on the outside of it. And that's what a lot of communities that are struggling with their own solutions, when someone comes knocking at the door and say, we have the solution for you, if they have a history of having policies imposed upon them, if they're not in control of their own health policies, often those are the people with the poorest health, people not in control of their own policies. So this was talking about normalizing harm reduction, just like we normalized harm reduction around condom use. We wanted to talk about the autonomy of the individual and how we used to, as Indigenous people, help people find their own truth. We didn't say, memorize this is the truth. We said, I will walk with you while you find your truth, and that's what harm reduction is. That's why this is called Walk With Me, Pathways to Health, is that philosophy of walking with people, and it's around readiness, what a person is ready for, and that also applies to communities. What are communities ready for? And that's why we need to work within the cultural framework of communities to help them determine their stage of readiness so the intervention, the harm reduction intervention, can be stage appropriate in terms of their readiness. So we introduced, we used something called the community readiness model and applied it to harm reduction and helped communities to gauge their readiness for doing this work. So back in 2011, right after this was published, of course, the Harper government told us we can't say harm reduction anymore, we can't do harm reduction. So that policy set us backwards. We were no longer able to convene large groups of Indigenous people to come together to talk about drugs. I ended up talking at the Union of Ontario Indians War on Drugs Conference. And I was the only one talking about harm reduction, about walking with people. But now we have a new government. And so the ways forward really can involve the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's many, many recommendations in there that can be applied to harm reduction, to HIV/AIDS, and to drug policy, but also the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And through these two policy documents, we can find some of these solutions only if we work with Indigenous peoples. We saw at the UNGAS on drugs, the United Nations General Assembly Special Session on Drugs, where they came out with the same, more of the same, and yet countries all around the world are doing their own thing. They're not following the UNGAS political declaration at all. We're going our own ways, and it's important that we involve people, that we use the principle of nothing about us without us. So I'm glad to see that there's so many people here living it, also telling about it. Thank you.
There's a really alert person on this side of the room who's going to ask Trevor afterwards about the business of needles in prison, if that's okay. Yeah. Okay. So one of you. Okay. I'll be calling on you. One of the reasons why I wrote about harm reduction in my column for the time that I had it was because progress is not going to be made until it's a comfortable topic of conversation across the broad sweep of the middle class. Our next speaker, Dessy Pavlova, is not just vice chair of the Board of Canadian Students for a Sensible Drug Policy. She's a writer and a marketing strategist who's working in the really rapidly growing field of cannabis communications. She's a cannabis patient. She has some thoughts about the role of cannabis in harm reduction. Dessy, please give her a welcome.
Hi, everybody. Well, first off, I want to say how inspiring it is to be with a room of people, a lot of which used to be a part of Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy and have grown since. So Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy is always working to reduce potential harms of bad drug policy on young people by including youth voices and input in some of the bigger policy decisions happening in Canada. Under the guise of protecting the youth, we often create policy that does more harm and does little to actively protect young people. When looking at doing less harm, we have to consult the evidence. I'll be talking about a youth roundtable organized by CSSDP, which focused on the elements of the Legalization Task Force discussion paper to show how we can do less harm, starting with cannabis. CSSDP noticed that youth were not being consulted outside of the general public consultation, and that stakeholder meetings focused more on organizations that work with youth rather than youth themselves. To give youth a clear voice on upcoming cannabis legalization, CSSDP, with support from LIFT and the International Center for Science in Drug Policy, hosted a youth roundtable in September called Youth Speak, Cannabis Policy in the 21st Century, which was attended by Task Force member Catherine Zahn, a representative from the Legalization Secretariat, MP Vaughan, and MP Erskine-Smith. We reviewed the discussions and produced a report based on feedback from 21 diverse youth voices in Toronto, including peer youth workers who work with at-risk youth, medical cannabis patients, students, and those who work in the illegal and legal cannabis industries. The young people who participated were also from the ages of 18 to 29. We translated the day into 10 main recommendations, but due to time, I'll only focus on a few of the overarching themes. The takeaway is that we need to be pragmatic about youth cannabis use and accompanying prevention and education efforts. The Ontario Student Drug Use and Health Survey shows that in 2015, self-reported alcohol use amongst grades 7 to 12 was over 45%, tobacco use 34%, and cannabis was at 22%, and each increased with age. These numbers could be even higher, as they don't capture many at-risk or homeless youth who may fall outside of what's reported in the survey. The highest use of cannabis was among those between 20 to 24, with 26% using in the last year. Prohibition has been constructed as a way to protect youth, but really hasn't done much to keep youth away from illegal drugs like cannabis. Instead, they have become one of the most criminalized populations for cannabis-related charges. The criminalization of youth has effects on their future in many ways, such as for loans, housing, financial aid, and even employment. And we have found that a criminal approach to cannabis possession, production, and distribution causes more harm than the actions themselves. In fact, some youth describe criminal records as a gateway to prison sentences and the cycle of imprisonment. Of course, this relates not just to cannabis, but all drugs. For example, youth talked about how age restrictions are not about when it's safe to initiate use, but when we think young people can make reasonable choices. Setting age limits too high means one of our largest cannabis-using populations is now outside the regulated system. High rates of use among young people is a key reason why youth felt the age limit should not be too high, and this recommendation was reflected in the task force recommendations. One of the most predominant and recurring themes centered on the criminalization of young people. We must ensure that we do not thinly veil restrictions which would actually do more harm as protecting youth. When it comes to criminalizing youth, the key recommendation focused on youth offenses that occur outside the regulated system. Like we see with underage alcohol access, cannabis access will happen outside the regulated system even if it mirrors drinking ages. For youth that use cannabis, it should not come with a criminal record. Youth recommended some kind of decriminalized or low penalty system like ticketing or community service, although there were some disagreements on what appropriate alternatives to criminal sanctions there could be. For example, ticketing could further disenfranchise the most vulnerable young people who can't afford to pay, while community service may take at-risk youth away from jobs and school. The task force recommendations also reflected that simple possession of cannabis by youth should not be a criminal offense. Many also noted that although outside the scope of the task force, past nonviolent criminal records should be expunged, particularly underscored by youth who worked with other at-risk youth and homeless youth, where the consequences are magnified. Young people also expressed the need to have access to evidence-based but non-judgmental education about cannabis and other drugs. A good example is iMind's learning resources from BC that focuses on increasing youth drug literacy. Most of the youth at the roundtable didn't remember anything but abstinence-only education, or anything specific about cannabis use in particular. Youth felt this may be because educators worry about being seen as pro-drug should they provide realistic drug education. Cannabis and other drug education needs to include harm reduction, and protecting the youth must include protecting those young people who do choose to use drugs. This should include information about things like driving under the influence, without stigmatizing use itself. For example, we've done a good job changing the public opinion on drinking and driving without stigmatizing alcohol use itself. Although cannabis education is a big positive step towards harm reduction in a legalized framework, it's only the first of many on the wider conversation of the future of drug use and drug education in Canada. The evidence on cannabis use also applies to other drugs, and it is better to take a public health approach to drug policy, such as adopting policies of decriminalization for all drugs, than one that puts the vague goal of protecting youth above all else. despite the harms its flawed implementation might cause. This especially relates to the overdose crisis in Canada. There is still a lot of work to do after cannabis legalization. CSSDP has been looking at education models from within Canada and other jurisdictions, such as Cannabis Conversations from Washington State, as well as the Canadian Centre for Substance Abuse's new Cannabis Education Toolkit. While these are a good starting point, we feel that the lack of inclusion of youth voices in both developing and testing these toolkits are problematic. For example, we found that often these toolkits overlook the nuances of cannabis use and overstate the scientific evidence, which could undermine the effectiveness of prevention efforts among youth, particularly those who are older, as they might have personal experiences that don't align with these descriptors and result in fostering distrust. Some strengths might include the acknowledgement of medical use and pleasure as reasons people use cannabis, as well as different talking points for different age groups. Youth at the Roundtable stressed the importance of education being developed with the input of youth and young people, including those who do and those who do not use cannabis, in order to test the curriculum and to provide feedback. Moving forward, Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy is beginning an education and research campaign that prioritizes youth input. We hope to stress the need for harm reduction in cannabis education and recognize that this is the first step in a much wider conversation around youth education and cannabis access. Access to age-appropriate materials which start in elementary school will be beneficial to youth, but these materials should be developed with the input of young people and really unpack what it means to protect young people in this context. For the young people we worked with, this meant keeping the criminalization of youth, which arguably does the most harm, at the forefront of these conversations. We're seeking collaborators on this cannabis education campaign and hope that we can develop meaningful tools to give young people access to the education they deserve. If you have questions or are interested in contributing, connect with us at cssdp.org or come talk to me after. Thank you.
It occurs to me that, because I once was a young person, it occurs to me that it's only dumb luck that I don't have a criminal record. On the subject of young people, cannabis, criminal records, I think you should huddle with Eugene and Pat afterwards. Our next speaker is Eugene Oscapella, and this is a real pleasure for me. Eugene is a researcher on legislative, trade, and social policy development in Canada. He's a professor in the Department of Criminology at the University of Ottawa, but he's a founding member of the Canadian Foundation for Drug Policy, an independent organization which studies, as you might guess, Canadian drug laws and policies. He's one of the smartest guys in the country on these issues. I have a hunch also that he has a few things to say about the results of the election of the great Satan to the south of us. Eugene, please.
Thank you, Joe. I now see you've created great expectations of me. I'm very, very pleased to be here today. I'm especially pleased to see, and I'd like to thank Walter for helping to organize this and Joe for moderating it, because I met Joe before on other occasions, and I'm delighted to be here with two of the 11 co-founders of the Canadian Foundation for Drug Policy, Dr. Diane Riley and Pat Erickson. I teach drug policy at the University of Ottawa. I have for almost 19 years now, and I tell my students I'm starting to get the hang of it. I also tell them that when I started working in the field almost 30 years ago, that I didn't have gray hair, and by the time they get some of the problems resolved that we're struggling with today, they're going to have gray hair. This is a long struggle. It's a long fight. I, like Pat, talking about the early 70s when she started working on this, thinking that, well, it's just a matter of logical explanation, doing the research, we'll explain it to people, and things will change. Well, that's what I felt when I got involved in 1988. It made so much sense. I was reading the Ledane Commission report, and all these arguments made so much sense. Prohibition made no sense. But boy, was I wrong when I thought that it's just a matter of rational debate. There are tremendous forces at play in maintaining a system of prohibition. Some of them self-interested forces, some of them people legitimately worried about what happens when we get rid of prohibition. But it was a very, very rude awakening for me when I saw the hostility with which these ideas were met. I can remember being called insane, crazy, and the media were not as charitable or thoughtful about this issue as they've become in recent years. The media many times was openly hostile to change, so it was a very, very difficult environment. We didn't have the internet 30 years ago, and that made life difficult, because I remember looking at doing a one-page ad in the Toronto Globe and Mail, and this would have been in the early 1990s, and it was $50,000 for a one-page ad. We didn't have the vehicles to communicate information about drug policy, to challenge that being put out by governments and police forces across the country and around the world. So we had a difficult time. There was also considerable US pressure on Canada and globally to maintain a system of prohibition. And that's been a fact of life for the past 100 years, that the United States was one of the principal forces in pushing for this prohibitionist model, the use of the criminal law to deal with drugs. People probably at that time, 30 years ago and 40 years ago, they may have had a more trusting attitude towards the government. So they were perhaps more vulnerable to accepting much of the propaganda. Donald Trump did not invent alternative facts. This has been going on for decades and decades in the world of drug policy and drug law reform. Propaganda has been a major part of a major obstacle to moving ahead. And like I said, there are enormous forces at play that profit from that continue to profit from prohibition. So this is not an easy sell. This is not like diabetes, where you come up with a cure or something that can help resolve the disease, and people jump at it and say that's great. No, that's not what drug policy is about. It takes a lot of explanation. But what do we have? We still have alternative facts. We'll still have, and there'll still be honest debate about the impact of drugs. We still don't know everything we know about cannabis. We still don't know everything we could know about tobacco and alcohol. We're going to continue to learn. We're going to continue to debate these things. But that's going to be an honest debate, I hope, or a more honest debate. We have the internet. The internet allowed the Canadian Foundation for Drug Policy to be an alternative voice in the discussion about drug policy. And groups like ours and many other groups, many of these groups are represented in this room and in other rooms around the country. They started putting out information to challenge the government monopoly on information about drug policy. And that really helped, I believe. So we're in a position now where the media can actually come to us. They know we exist, and they can ask us for our opinions on things. Whereas before it was quite difficult to get that sort of stuff out. There's a much more sympathetic government today. Living through the Harper government, where basically the term harm reduction, as you heard before, was banned from the lexicon of government, and where the attitude was very punitive, where they set up legislation called the Respect for Communities Act to make it virtually impossible to open up supervised injection facilities. They were trying to defeat a very strong, unanimous Supreme Court of Canada judgment in September of 2011 that basically was going to compel them to allow supervised injection sites to open up in the country. And they did everything in their power to stop this. We've now got a government that's more sympathetic to change. We have a much more articulate media discussion of drug policy issues, and Joe was actually one of those forces, because I've met Joe a couple of times in previous visits to Toronto and watched his reports in the Toronto Star. And given that a lot of people in the pre-sort of cell phone era and pre-internet news era got their information from newspapers, that's extremely critical. We're using more sensitive language today, unless you're the Harper government called drug users junkies. We're going to get junkies off the street, and we're going to throw drug dealers in prison. Of course, they forgot that they'd have to cut people in half to do that, because many drug users, heavily dependent drug users, are selling to be able to maintain their own habits, which is a function of prohibition. But we have some very, very profoundly pressing issues, and fentanyl, carfentanil. It's hard to perhaps see light in this situation, because we're losing, there are 550 people who die from homicides in this country every year, and we're probably going to lose more than a couple thousand from opioid overdoses in this country, if not more. This truly is a crisis. But what gives me some hope, and unfortunately it hasn't helped the lives of those who've gone before us, but what's given me some hope is the way that governments and people are starting to talk about it. There's less and less discussion of, let's get the police to do something about this. People have begun to realize that the police can't solve these problems, and the police are less adamant that they are the ones who should be solving these problems. So that's a significant shift. Look at what the discussion's been about when we talk about dealing with the fentanyl and carfentanil issues and the other opiate issues today. We're talking about naloxone distribution. We're talking about better prescription practices. We're talking about safe injection facilities, expanded access to treatment, maintenance programs, including heroin maintenance, expanded access to mental health help, which is we desperately need in this country. More open discussion about mental health issues. Good Samaritan provisions in law so that people can call the police and let them know that somebody's overdosing and not be afraid that they're going to be prosecuted. Better public education. Discussion of things like returning fentanyl patches. Getting away from a lot of the moral judgments. And maybe that is in part because some of the people who are dying from fentanyl overdoses are middle-class people. They're middle-class people. They're not the people who have been considered to be disposable in society, because society can be very cruel on those who they consider to be disposable. But when a 30-year-old husband and wife in suburban Calgary die of fentanyl overdoses when they take drugs and they leave 3 orphan children, that affects the public, and it gets a much more sympathetic perspective. Unfortunately, that may be the one way that we're going to have a more open and honest discussion about this. We've had resistance to privatized prisons in this country. In the United States, privatized prisons lobby for tougher drug laws to get more people in jail because they make more money having people locked up in cages. It's obscene. It's absolutely obscene in a supposedly democratic world that this should happen, but that's the reality of it. We've been able to push that back to some extent in Canada. The Obama administration gave some hope. His Deputy Attorney General basically said, look, we're not going to pursue the states using federal criminal law, those states who have legalized marijuana, if you have responsible programs in place. So, there have been lots of good things happening despite the death and destruction that we still continue to see in this country. What I am concerned about is the nut bar we've got south of the border. He's a very dangerous man. He, at some point, a number of years ago, did say that he thought drugs should be legalized because he understood the mechanics of the black market and prohibition and how that enriched organized crime. But he's just appointed a guy, wants to appoint a guy as Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who was a dyed-in-the-wool drug warrior. And that could put things back tremendously in the United States. I mean, there's 60 million people who now live in states where recreational cannabis has been legalized. So it's not going to be that easy to do, but they could roll that back, and who knows what this government's going to do. And if we go back to the days as we had under the Bush administration and previous U.S. administrations, when the U.S. government was openly hostile to attempts to reform drug laws in Canada, it would be a very, very unfortunate situation. So that's my major concern right now. I think we've turned a corner in some ways in this country. From when I look at 30 years to now, we've still got major problems with drugs in this country, but I think the discussion is more open, more honest than it's been. If we can avoid being pressured by the United States unfairly, has been the case in the past, I think there's some hope for us to move ahead. I encourage you to keep fighting. Don't worry if you get a few gray hairs in the process. It's believe me, it's worth it. Thank you.
So I gave these guys a task earlier, and they all remember it. And you guys ask Eugene about the next big steps, the next big fights in the development of good, strong policy in this country. So I'll remember this. Okay. Raffi Balian, our next speaker. Raffi is the manager of the Counterfeit Harm Reduction Program at the South Riverdale Community Health Center. More to the point, he's an active drug user and the author of Harm Reduction at Work, a guide for organizations employing people who use drugs. He is one of the bravest guys I know. Welcome him, please.
I thought Eugene is one of the smartest guys in Canada, period, not just in this field. I was asked to speak about what do I think, what are the stuff that has to happen to end this this madness. Well, I have only 10 minutes. I can talk about a few things that I think that should happen in this field, at least. One is we need a clear understanding of what harm reduction is that we all can agree on. The organization I work with, Counterfeit Harm Reduction Program, our definition of harm reduction is that it's a philosophy and a set of actions that tries to decrease and eliminate the harms associated with criminalization of drugs. Now, if you ask the traditional definition of harm reduction is decrease the harms associated with the decrease of drug use. We, at our organization, we don't think so. We think that reducing harm reduction is not about reducing harms from alcohol and tobacco, it's about reducing harms from illegal drugs. And there are reasons that we adopted this resolution. And it's, just to let you know, it's gaining traction. Now CAPUD also, the Canadian Association of People Who Use Drugs, has adopted this, this same definition of harm reduction. In any other definition of harm reduction, the harms are still associated with drugs. There is the assumption that drugs are harmful. Drugs are value neutral. They can be beneficial, they can be neutral, they can be harmful. It depends on how you use them. The issue is that when we look at drugs as harmful substances, its users become the problem. You know you're using harmful substance. Why are you using them? So the stigma is still with the person who is using drugs. By making the system as the problem, we remove that focus from the drug user to the system. It also takes our community from victim and victimizer mentality and gives us the opportunity to work from a more positive platform to foster change, positive change. In a criminalized drug culture where drugs are the bad things, where people who use drugs are the problem, the harshness of the punishment becomes a subjective issue. As long as drugs are illegal, drug users are ipso facto criminal. And we're subhumans, we're others, and subject to sanctions. Just look at what's happening in Philippines right now, what happened in Indonesia during Suharto regime. And here in Canada, if you're a black man or an indigenous man, drug laws are used against you to arrest you, to stop you, to take you to prison. So it's really imperative that we work from the assumption that harm reduction is the reduction of drugs associated with criminal prohibition. There are people who argue this. They have relevant, I think their arguments are relevant, but I still think my bias is towards this definition. The other thing that I think we have to do, and this is a little bit more controversial, that we have to start disassociating ourselves from anything that has to do with traditional abstinence-based models. You know, there is this assumption that, not every model works for everyone. A model that is 5% successful doesn't pass the test. You can't say not every model works for everyone, so we have to find a model that has a success rate of 5%, or say 10%, or even 15%. If 10-15% was a test given to harm reduction, we would not have any funding. Also, this model has made our community invisible. Nothing we take is taken seriously because we're either sick, or we're in denial, or we're selfish and self-centered individuals. The other important reason we have to start dissociation, getting away from this model, is gives politicians have a tendency to move towards what's safe, what's less controversial. Pretending that abstinence models work will embolden politicians to continue favoring these models, placing inordinate amount of resources and money. Around this, I say throw out the bathwater, the baby with the bathwater, because the water is so toxic, no baby could have survived in it. We need to form meaningful partnerships between academic, professional, harm reduction staff, harm reduction activists, and people who use drugs. We will be able to do away with prohibition only when we are well organized. But our community is really fragmented. We're barely surviving, we're always broke, we're stressed out all the time, and a lot of us are sick. We're sick with HIV, HCV, or sick because we're not accessing the healthcare system. Our community dies very young, by the way. We are survivors when we reach 60. We're too divided and fragmented among ourselves. Some of the problem is that historically, most marginalized folks tend to think conservatively, only through education and being able to, exposed to other ideas that our community will grow and develop. We also have, a lot of our community have been to a lot of abstinence-based treatment. So we have a lot of hate towards ourselves, we have a lot of investment towards abstinence, so there's a lot of that going on also. And we're not funded adequately. We need help organizing ourselves, and we need that help from you guys, from everyone. But that help shouldn't be, it should not serve organizational agendas. We need you to advocate ourselves, to express our ideas and agendas, but do so without tokenizing us. Let us decide who we want to come and represent us. So again, to use the Spanish Civil War battle cry, nothing about us without us, should be honored by every person who works in this field. And you will find that we'll give 100 back, hundredfold back to the community. Make the difficult decision for the state. Don't be afraid of breaking the law. And I say that I working in this field. I've always tried to work with the idea that what the state is doing is a war crime. What we're doing is the right thing, and we have to. If you look at the most successful programs, OST, NEP, needle exchange programs, OST, opiate substitution therapy like methadone, Suboxone, needle exchange, or supervised injection sites. These are programs that mimic legalization. These are the programs. So we have to, everything we do has to replicate legalization. At every step, you are opportunity to advocate for the lowest threshold programs. And we have to control the messages through media messages. Be vigilant when you do. For example, media right now speaks about fentanyl. There is no fentanyl problem. There is a prohibition problem. Fentanyl is just one drug. Tomorrow, it used to be oxys, if you remember. Before that, it was crack. After that, it was, right now it's fentanyl. Tomorrow, it will be W compounds. The problem is not the drugs. We can deal with the drugs if we know we have the space to deal safely. The problem is that criminalization has to end. Once criminalization ends, we can deal with everything in much more safer manner. Okay, I'm going to stop now.
I told you he was a brave guy. There was a time probably when much of that conversation would have had to be held in secret. Walter, how much time do we have for questions? Half an hour. I am so goddamn task-oriented that I'm just going to remind you that there's some specific things you might want to go back to. You might want to talk to Pat more about drug policy as a public health issue. You might want to talk to Trevor about what was that about needles in prisons? Was that somebody over here's got that question? Somebody might draw Dessy out a little bit more about the criminalization of youth and about the normalization of the conversation. Somebody really should ask Eugene a little bit more about what are the deepest, the sharpest challenges right now in drug policy development. Now that we've made gains, what next? Somebody might want to ask that. And Raffi, you know what? I said I was task-oriented. Raffi's got a lot more to say about absolutely everything, and you could ask him what didn't he get a chance to say up here. So I'm going to kind of keep track of questions, and they'll answer from there. And forgive me, I'll sort of do my best. I saw a question here. If you could address it to one of the members of the... Sure, it's kind of... Can you stand, please? Eugene, you want to tackle that?
Well, first of all, yes, we've certainly had racial disparity in our drug law enforcement, but it's gone on for well over a century. in this country. It's not anything new. The opium laws, the cannabis. If you look at the racist rantings of Emily Murphy before the cannabis laws were enacted, this has been a long-standing problem. There are hundreds of thousands of Black and Hispanic Americans in prisons. We have racial disparity in our drug laws here. What can we do to absolve these people of criminal responsibility once we change the law? Can we pardon them all? And that's certainly something that we need to look at. There are some cases it's going to be difficult. Was there violence involved in the particular action? We know that the drug trade is violent, and unfortunately, it's regulated by violence. So, in those cases, it might be more difficult to argue that there should be full pardons. But certainly, in many other cases, that's one of the issues that we really need to look at: is pardoning people from this and cleaning away their records.
Anybody know what happened in Portugal when that happened?
Well, Portugal didn't legalize; they decriminalized. So it's still, you're brought before essentially a committee if they find you with in possession of up to I think about a 10-day supply of the drug, and you're brought before a drug dissuasion committee, and they might have a psychologist there, maybe a medical person, a social worker, or whatever, and they discuss your drug use. But I don't think I don't know. Do you know, Pat, if they actually absolve people of existing criminal records?
Good question. I don't know.
But I think it's going to be a difficult thing to do politically, but it may be the correct thing to do politically.
So I have a question over here and then one over here.
So my question is for Eugene as well. Probably the only good news that I read in the States last week was in Seattle, where the council approved a safe injection site. And I'm wondering if you could speak about some of the barriers from an American standpoint, if you're aware of them, of what obstacles are they currently facing to get that opened up?
Are you safe injection sites?
Yeah.
Or just more
Safe
sensible
injection.
drug policy?
Safe injection.
I wouldn't want to sort of wade into that specific issue because simply because I don't know enough about the actual sort of machinations of safe injection sites in the States. There's certainly been hostility to harm reduction in many American states. I mean, and under the current administration, I mean, if you look at the inaugural address of Donald Trump, I mean, he speaks of crime and drugs and that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. This American carnage stops right here and stops right now. And he openly praised Duterte, the sort of the murderous quasi-dictator in the Philippines, who's been encouraging people to go out and murder drug users, not just traffickers, but drug users, and who himself seems to have admitted to killing people in a previous existence. So it's so hard to tell what's going to happen in that country right now. I mean, we're all we just don't know. There are wonderful people working in the United States. Many of the people who got me interested in this were American, working very, very hard. They're trying very hard on these things, but there's such strong resistance to some of the things that we've come to accept quite openly in this country. I mean, the discussion of safe injection sites, that discussion has opened up enormously in the past few years. I think in this country, I don't know if that's happening in many parts of the States yet. And I'm sorry, I can't be more specific. I don't know specifically what I'm obviously more focused on what we're doing in this country.
I've got a question over here, guy in the blue shirt.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm from the Toronto Psychedelic Society. A safe place to have conversations about drugs. We support harm reduction. And this is to Raffi's point about we're not organized. Society's growing very rapidly, and we'd love you all to come and have a safe place to talk about drugs. Thanks.
I've got a question here.
Hi, so I was wondering if there are any specific drug policies or strategies that are being currently considered that can take some of the strain off Canada's healthcare system.
Good question. Anybody in particular you want to answer that?
I suppose Pat or anyone who has.
Pat, do you want to take a stab at that?
I think there are more likely to take the strain off the criminal justice system, and that's been one of their objectives. But I think, again, the evidence that has been coming through from places that are treating drugs as health issues are that you actually save resources in the long run by looking after people earlier and getting them into treatment earlier, getting people not fearful to go to a hospital if they're experiencing an overdose. But it sounds like one of those questions health economists will have to answer.
Here's a question right up front here.
I've got a pretty loud voice, so maybe I don't need to be mic'd. I'm Nancy Graham. I'm a public health nurse with the City of Toronto. I was wondering, I get calls from different groups asking if I know of testing kits or coasters or things where young people, or anybody really, who wants to party and use a substance to check it for fentanyl or other contaminants. Does any of the panelists know if there's such products that exist? Thank you.
There are some products that exist. The fentanyl drug testing kits are not entirely accurate right now, from what I understand, but they are available. And really, it's all about research and continued.
Available where?
There's a few people that are slowly putting them together. Unfortunately, a lot of the substances that create these drug testing kits are not so easy to get into the country. So that's why they're not so widely available.
Raffi, do you have a thought on that?
No, I thought I'm seeing the person who can answer that this question best is here, Nazli, if you want. I don't know. I'm sorry putting you.
The Trip Project has reagent testing kits that you can buy.
Who does?
Trip Project.
Trip Project?
You can text the tripwire. There's a number. There's also an email. A Trip Project person will meet you and sell you a reagent kit. Dessy was right that they're not accurate at this moment in testing for fentanyl. And also, there's limitations to these kits in the sense that they only tell you what is roughly in the substance. It turns a color that you match up to a grip. So you kind of vaguely know what's mostly in there. Tells you nothing about potency. So I think what Raffi is referring to is there are some efforts across the city, organizations working with Toronto Public Health and the three frontline harm reduction agencies that are opening supervised injection sites, alongside my organization, International Center for Science and Drug Policy, that's trying to get gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, i.e. lab equipment that tells us a lot more and can give really proficient information on purity and potency that they have in like Europe and stuff, where they're more advanced with that drug checking harm reduction.
Okay, I have a question over here, and then I've got a question back here. Okay. You have to wave your hand if you want to ask a question.
So I'm one of the chapter leaders at U of T here for CSSPP, same group that Dessy is a part of. We throw events and other things like that, so if anyone wants to get involved who's a student here at U of T, it's really fun and there's a lot of opportunities. My question is the setup question. I was wanting to know what the current state of needle exchange programs are in Canadian federal prisons. And I saw something in the news recently about Justin Trudeau's government. I wasn't sure if he's restricting that, or I'd like some clarification on that if possible.
I can address the lawsuit, but as far as the state of needle provision in general, I don't think I can speak on that specifically. But there was a lawsuit to challenge the failure by Corrections Services Canada and others to make sterile injection equipment available to inmates of federal penitentiaries and for no other or improper purpose. And that was filed in 2002. And a man named Stephen Simons is the individual who spent time in prison and asked for clean needles, was refused, and in partnership with the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network, Prisoners with HIV/AIDS Support Action Network, or PASAN, and the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network, and CAIDI, the Canadian AIDS Treatment Information Exchange, they filed a lawsuit against the Minister of Public Safety, Correctional Services Canada, and the Commissioner of the Corrections Service, and the Attorney General. Harper government was totally fighting us. They were not going to talk to us. And once the Liberals took over, they talked about mediation, and a date was set for last week. The 2 days before the mediation was to proceed, we received an email from the lawyer for the federal government indicating that they could not proceed with mediation, that they didn't provide a reason, but only that they were unable at this time to come up with a proposal that will address the issues in the application in a fashion anticipated by the applicants. So there was lots of suggestions made about what exactly we expect. And it seemed like there was no indication that they were getting cold feet until we got that email. So now we're starting to say, beware of good-looking Liberal politicians.
That I just got to insert something here. The absolute hypocrisy of that guides us. The easiest place in the world to get drugs is in prison. The hardest place to get sensible harm reduction in terms of drug use and needle use is in prison. What the hell's wrong with this picture? Eugene?
If I could just add to this, is another mechanism for dealing with governments that put people's lives at risk, and that's the notion, and it's actually not a civil lawsuit. You see, a civil lawsuit, you sue somebody in government, the government protects them, and they get, they pay their legal fees or whatever. But there's something called the private criminal prosecution. And if a government official doesn't, you can make the argument that if a government official has a duty to safeguard the health of prisoners, various government officials have that duty. Their job is not to allow prisoners to die; it's to restrict their liberty, not to destroy their health. And if they know that there's a situation that could be remedied by a particular action and they fail to take it, you could make the argument that there's criminal negligence, and that accusation of criminal negligence would land on the shoulders of the individual. So it's actually a much more compelling type of force or persuasive tool, because if somebody feels that they're going to be prosecuted criminally rather than just sued and protected by the government, if you're prosecuted criminally, you could go to jail.
Let me deconstruct that just a tiny bit. What he's saying is it falls on your shoulders. If you know someone in prison who has trouble with this, or if you're related to someone who's in prison, or if your organization works with people who are in prison, the onus is on you to take that forward. There's a question here and then one here. So you there, the tall guy? Well, it's your turn.
I'm curious if there's a database out there in Canada right now that you can send your drugs to that will do a GC. Are you guys the only guys trying to put that in the works, or is that already established somewhere? Does anybody know?
I think it's a long conversation.
Yeah, maybe afterwards. So a question here.
Yeah, my question is to Dessy, I believe. I have some colleagues in mental health nursing and psychiatry that their reasoning for wanting to restrict marijuana to youth between ages of 14 to 18 is that likelihood of higher chance, I guess, of developing psychosis and developmental stages. Can that be seen in your view as a harm reduction strategy in itself, or do you feel like that's still prohibiting proper education or cannabis?
That's a complicated question, partially because there's more of a correlation rather than a causation for that. So we don't know everything about cannabis use, and we don't know everything about how cannabis affects youth. But I think the starting point is education. And, let's be realistic. The cannabis legalization is going to be very similar to alcohol legalization. I doubt that we're going to allow 14-year-olds in a legalized framework to access cannabis, just like we don't with alcohol. But
you're saying the education piece should still be there for you?
100%. Yep, it's all about education, I think.
And just a follow-up question on that, is there a non-judgmental resource right now that's being implemented in school, or is that still kind of
It's
okay, Nancy,
There's a question back here.
It's for Dessy. One, we may end up with
In what sense to have?
You do that instead of like, I don't know, I'm thinking that if LCBO can like restricting the access to cannabis by like controlling the distribution can prevent youth from accessing cannabis.
I think that generally, just like now with prohibition, youth can access cannabis. The real way to prevent youth from using it is to provide the education as to what that can do to them and why they should or shouldn't use it.
So you guys are like really letting me down. I don't see all these hands, but so I got one here, and then I have a question of my own.
Raffi, I'm going to follow up on something that you said. So I was thinking about your comment that you snuck in there about low barrier access to, I think opiate substitution, but I've been thinking more generally. I was just curious about your thoughts on this. We think about laws and legal changes, but I often think there are regulations that come from either the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario or regulations in other government ways, how we fund our community health centers. I'm curious what your thoughts on what would be needed to make sure we actually have low barrier, low threshold programs so people get access sooner and when needed.
That's a huge question, a good question. When I started working in this field, I started using drugs, and when I started working in this field in 1993, and I remember getting calls from moms, dads, lovers, begging me to get their loved ones on methadone. At the time, methadone was the only thing. And I used to think, well, if I could get myself on this, I couldn't get myself on methadone. The waiting period was 6 months. Nowadays, we don't have that, but I can't pay people to get on methadone right now because of all the structures that there are, or Suboxone. It's so difficult. Or if we get them on, a few weeks later, they're off it. I think that methadone, everything. No one in this room would want to get their wine prescribed by a doctor. If that happened, there would be a revolution. I think that the same kind, we have to find ways. Legalization, of course, is one of the lowest barrier thing. But next to that, I think we have to look at other models in India. For example, Sharan, which is a community organization, does they don't prescribe, they distribute Suboxone. We should look at these models that other places exist where we can lower the barrier. In Scotland, during Christmas, community support workers, harm reduction workers go on the street to make sure that people are not short of methadone. People who use opiates are not sick, so they give them methadone. So we have to develop, we have to have community organizations involved in this, at least work with doctors. Right now, in the past, how long has been? 23 years I've been working in this field, and methadone probably started a couple of years before that. For 25 years, every policy change that has happened around OST has happened for the benefit of doctors. Not one change has happened for the convenience of people who use these services. We don't have a say. There used to be a patient advisory committee that was, for one, in one sense, it's good that it was dissolved because not one of the recommendations in the 20 years or so that they existed was passed or was accepted. We have to, I don't know what it is, we have to make doctors and physicians, I think it's us users, we have to go and shame them and have make sure that we have a say of how these programs are going to run. Otherwise, we're going to be in this mess for a long time.
I actually wouldn't mind having a prescription for certain kinds of wine. But I will say that, okay, I've got a question. I have a question. There's one here and there's one here. this is actually a reminder first, that if we didn't have alcohol, and if it was invented tomorrow, we wouldn't get any. Trevor, tell me 3 things that you've learned or you've observed about your work with the UN committee.
3 things I've learned. Well, one thing I learned is that UNAIDS is the only UN structure that has civil society as actual board members. And that is an example that we would like to see followed with other, like the Global Fund and other UN agencies, UNGAS, these different things that come together where we're actually decision makers rather than people that give advice. That's one thing. Secondly, since we're talking about drugs and harm reduction, you know, Eastern Europe and Russia, there's a huge crisis there right now. And when they stopped distributing methadone and clean needles, thousands, tens of thousands of drug users died. This is not, harm reduction does save lives. That's clear to me, very, very clear. Thirdly is that Trudeau's basically the last man standing in terms of liberal leaders in the world. This is a fight that is going to be really hard to win. The pendulum is swinging to the right. So those are my 3 things that might apply to
I don't know if you get to write as a, but you've got a really good editorial piece for one of the newspapers. There was a question over here somewhere.
My name is Chris. I'm a first student at Dessy University. I'm not sure whether Pat or Eugene would be better at answer this question. I'm wondering that in terms of the current evidence right now, would a decriminalization of drugs or a legalization framework be a better option if we were to be pushing for it?
You said drugs, and I think it's really important to look at different drugs and think about how a model might be adapted to them. So when you say, if you're saying cannabis, it would be in many ways a really positive step for the government to have removed the possession offense as part of their interim plan, but they haven't done that. And perhaps because, if I may speculate, they worry that that would raise the questions, well, why aren't you doing it for all the drugs? I'd like to see that happen sooner rather than later. I think there's going to be stages in which these frameworks are examined and developed. And as you just were commenting, I mean, Canada is really being watched now globally. We were featured in The Economist. You know, the world is watching to see what happens with this cannabis experiment. You'll get it right. Well, it's impossible to get it right the first time. We didn't get tobacco right, or alcohol probably still haven't. So it has to be an ongoing issue. So I think to just say, well, decriminalization, which reduces or removes penalties for the user, is an important step. Yes, I wish that had happened 40 years ago, but I don't see that we're ever going to just leap into legal regulation of all illicit drugs. We'll have to develop our own country models, our own, related to our own use patterns, what our experts know, who are on the ground, you know, working in communities, and it's going to take time. So, you know, it's hard to be patient, but I think we have to be, and we have to, I would like to see the marijuana one go forward without too much quibbling, just because I think it could get scuttled otherwise. If the forces, I'm sure, are sort of marshalling out there, they haven't disappeared, right?
So I had a question over here somewhere. Can you stand, please?
I'm from the YMCA Youth Substance Use Program, and first I want to say we have testing kits as well. Well, we're actually getting these testing kits. We've had them for a long time, but they were from Dance Safe and they weren't actually very good. So I think we're getting them from the same place that Trip gets them.
Well, we have an unfortunate historical precedent. I mean, what Donald Trump is going to do is anybody's guess, and we just don't know. We just don't know. I mean, for a guy who praises the Duterte in the Philippines and makes these remarks about carnage in American cities, it's hard to believe. It's hard to know what he's going to do. We have a precedent from the early years of this century, from 2003, 2004. The Liberal government introduced a bill which they didn't call it decriminalization. They did at first, and then they backed away from that term. That would remove the prospect of criminal penalties for simple possession, and then they added to that the production of small quantities of cannabis. And they had a majority government under Jean Chrétien. The bill died once. It was revived. It died a second time, both times under a majority government. Why it wasn't passed was an American pressure. There was a lot of hostile rhetoric from the U.S., from John Walters, the U.S. drug czar, who tragically, his father was born in Toronto, so he's partly Canadian. There was a lot of harsh rhetoric when we wanted to open up supervised injection facilities in Vancouver from the United States. That could happen again. I hope it won't, but if it does, they have very powerful levers to apply to us. Are they going to prevent Canadian imports of softwood lumber? It may not be a direct threat, but they might go ahead, and it might be something, where they say, look, if you don't go ahead and go along with us in this way, we're going to do this, we're going to punish you in some other way. And it's a fact of life that we have to deal with. Where we had hope was under the Obama administration. They allowed these states to go ahead and move ahead with state laws legalizing cannabis. And unfortunately, at that time, just as they were getting more liberal, we had Harper come in, so we were in a difficult situation. Now we've got a more open regime to change, but I just don't know. It's so hard. That's what frightens me, because we've come close before and been knocked back, and that's why it ain't over till it's over. I want till that legislation is enacted and in force, I'm not going to breathe easy.
There's a question here, and then I've got a question over here.
My question has to do with something I call the cool parent syndrome. And I know of 3 talented, bright young people, 12 and 13 years old, who got caught in the middle of it. People get married, then they get divorced, then they get competing for the coolness and the hipness in the eyes of their 11, 12, 13-year-old children, as a result of which at least 2 of those children whom I know and like got caught in a cannabis dependency because their parents, in order to out-cool each other, kept overloading these kids with more cannabis than was balanced for their systems.
Can you bring this to a question?
And yes, my question is for Eugene. In terms of educating such parents so that they don't bust the chops of their kids in order to be popular, where would you suggest I send them?
It's very difficult when you've got the open hostility and the open warfare that happens in some marital breakups or spousal sorts of breakups, to go ahead and get the parents to act rationally sometimes, and that's the real dilemma. It's a broad. I mean, if the parents are actually giving cannabis to their kids, that is a criminal offense. It would probably remain a criminal offense under the new law, I would suspect, or a very serious type of offense. But these are broad social issues, and it happens not only with cannabis but with other types of behaviors and sort of permissive attitudes by parents, because they're trying to secure their position with the children, and it's one of the unfortunate consequences in a society that has these sorts of breakups. I don't know if there is a solution. I'm not a psychologist. I don't know the best way to address that, but it's something that is worrisome.
Anyone knows of organizations that could help with this in a compassionate way, I would love to know that.
Okay, I've got a question here, and I'll take one more question after that, and then.
My question's for Eugene. I think it needs to be asked. Looking at the war on drugs is kind of like a dragon, and I'm going to show you the top
forward. Where are we aiming on this track? Thanks.
I wish I could say there was like the drug policy equivalent of a killer app that would go ahead and sort of solve problems. There isn't. I think this is a continuum, and I think we're doing a lot of the right things. We've changed the tone of the discussion over the past decades, and the people in this room who are here listening and participating in your own ways, you're helping to change the tone of the discussion. We need to through education and calm discussion, as I hope this would be considered, we need to go ahead and get people to say, yeah, of course, well, that's the way to do it. Yes, that's the right thing to do. Of course we need supervised injection facilities. Of course we need better maintenance programs. Of course we need better mental health treatment. We need to keep working towards getting members of the general public to accept that as the obvious, logical approach to dealing with some of these issues. So it's very much a continuing public education effort, I believe.
I've got a question here.
Hi, so I'm the director of CSSDP at U of T chapter. Hi, Dessy. Nice to finally meet you. My question's for the panel. I'm aware that there are viable alternatives to the opioid crisis. I mean, we have seen on the news that there's the potential for cannabis being a viable substitution for pain, which a lot of these users are going through some tough times, and they could be substituting their opioids with cannabis. There's also a powerful psychedelic known as ibogaine, which has been getting a lot of traction as far as curing people overnight of their addictions without the withdrawal symptoms. So I was wondering if you guys know of any sort of developments or anything of that nature regarding those two substances.
Raffi, you got something on that?
Well, I want to answer your question in a different way. We have to be careful around this war on prescription drugs. Substituting it with cannabis may help some people, but I think the focus recently has been a wrong one around the fear from prescription drugs. It does kill some people, that's right, but it also saves tens of thousands of people who inject drugs. I use only prescription drugs for my injection. I use fentanyl, actually, fentanyl patches. And I think that has kept me alive for the past 13, 14 years because I know what I'm using and I know exactly what I'm getting. So we have to be really careful around this. In terms of overdose deaths recent years, this overdose crisis, if you look at percentages, only a fraction is through prescription drugs. Yet the focus has been prescription drugs because those are the drugs that have killed most of the middle class folks. Cannabis may be a good substitution for some folks, but it's not a good substitution for people who inject drugs. So we have to be very careful when we're having these discussions. Getting away from prescription, I understand that having doctors becoming our dealers is not the ideal thing, but we don't have anything that has replaced. I wish we could come up with a script, doctors being given the power to write scripts for people who get sick if they don't get they have dependence, physical dependence on opioids. If that would happen, I have no difficulty at all being more careful around who is being prescribed and who is not being prescribed around pain and finding alternatives to pain medication. The problem is, I know there are all these discussions around alternative ways, more access to psychologists, more access to massage therapists. Our community doesn't go to doctors. Our community is so marginalized. We have such horrible experience with physicians, with other, even with massage parlors or psychologists, psychiatrists. We don't go, we are the first to get sick and the last to go and seek treatment for anything. So these are not going to help us in the beginning until all these stigmatizing factors are slowly removed. It's going to be a long course, so we have to be a little bit careful around the language when we come to alternative to pain medication. Just
Raffi,
want to put this out there.
I just want to take one more question here before we wrap up.
This question is also for Raffi. I was just wondering if you could speak to, like, I just heard a couple comments throughout tonight talking about how regulation or legalization, decriminalization has to be sort of unique for each substance, and how we can sort of talk about that in a way that doesn't lead to judgment about certain substances, and some substances need to be regulated more. So if you could speak to that. Sometimes I feel like there's more openness to cannabis and legalization, but other substances we're still not open to.
I'm glad you brought it out. I mean, I use every drug that there is, and I find cannabis the most fearful for me. I get when I use I shoot up heroin and I can do my work better. Nobody would know that I'm using heroin, but if I smoke a joint, I'll be too. My mind would be too smoky, kind of, to be able to do anything. Well, I'm not saying I don't think. I don't see differences in harmfulness among the. That's not the way I operate. But although I can see why there has to be a step-by-step approach around decriminalization, legalization. I think it's a positive step that we're going with cannabis, but I think that the language should also, we have to hammer that all drugs should become decriminalized. I would accept right now some of what Jesse was saying. Possession, for example, starting with possession, that would be a big step forward. Then going to decriminalization, then going towards legalization for all drugs. I don't know. How we can, we may have to go from one, pot first, opiates later, cocaine later. We may have to do that. I don't know how that's going to happen, but I think that we have to start with the, possession, and then go to the, see how the road takes us, I guess.
Without being too presumptuous, I'm going to sort of draw things towards the conclusion here just by saying that I hope you've learned an awful lot from these guys. But all of you at the table, I hope you've had a chance to learn from some of the questions from this very smart audience about where the next steps are going to be. Right now, however, I would like to ask Walter to come up and say a few words and draw this thing to a conclusion.
Oh, thanks very much, Joe. Thanks to all of you on the panel. It has been an absolutely wonderful evening, and everything we hoped it would be. And thanks to all of you. There are a lot of you I've met, and many of you I've never seen before, and that's always exciting. I hope you will be in touch with us. We'd like to be in touch with you. We passed around a sign-in sheet, in which case I can let you know about other events. But also now there's time for you to have conversations with each other, with people you know, with people you don't know. You could pick their minds, they can pick yours. You can network. I think there's some food left, I'm not sure. No. But finally, just thank you very much for being here and being a wonderful audience. And thanks to all of you on the panel for being wonderful panel.